Welcome to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 introduces activity-based costing, which is a tool that has been embraced by a wide variety of service, manufacturing, and nonprofit organizations to more accurately assign indirect costs to products and services. So in Chapter 4, we talked about just allocating overhead. Chapter 5 goes into a more detailed and accurate process for allocating overhead based on actual activities as opposed to selecting only one cost driver. So first we're going to start off with explaining how activity-based costing improves accuracy in determining the cost of products and services. The traditional cost systems that we learned about in Chapter 4 were created when manufacturing processes were very labor intensive. Because of the intensive labor, most companies tended to use direct labor hours as an overhead allocation base, so they only had one cost driver. However, there's a growing number of accountants, myself included, who believe that direct labor hours is not a good basis for allocating overhead costs. And in fact, we should be looking for a different allocation scheme that actually allocates overhead based on what's specifically driving the cost and what activity is related to driving that cost. Excuse me. So the development of a single company-wide cost driver. So you can see under labor-intensive processes, overhead costs are relatively small, and the allocations may be inaccurate, but the amounts are relatively insignificant. However, in more modern automated processes, overhead costs are relatively large and labor costs are relatively small. Therefore, the allocation of large amounts of overhead based on direct labor in an automated process can result in unreliable information that doesn't make sense. So here we're looking at two different jobs. Using the traditional concept of a predetermined overhead rate, which we talked about in Chapter 4, using direct labor hours as the cost driver, let's look at how we would assign $120 of overhead to these two jobs. Our total overhead is $120. The total labor hours are 8, 2 plus 6. That gives us $15 per hour, times 2 hours for job 1 is $30, times 6 hours for job 2 gives us $90. Now, let's assume that automation increases overhead from $120 to $420, and it reduces the job 2 labor hours from 6 hours to 1 hour. Now, let's allocate the $420 overhead to the two jobs using direct labor again as the cost driver. You can see that we come up with different results. We're taking the $420 divided by now 3 labor hours gives us $140 per hour. Job 1 is getting $280 of the total overhead cost, and job 2 is getting $140. This doesn't really make sense because the reason that our overhead costs increased was because job 2 is now more automated. Therefore, we have more overhead, but their labor hours are reduced. So this skews the information. Often, automation generates costs which have no cause and effect relationship with the driver that we picked. Therefore, we adopt the activity-based cost drivers to improve the accuracy of indirect cost allocations. So this is what I was just talking about. So based on the level of complexity, the less complex your overhead, you're going to be using one company-wide overhead rate. The more complex the level of overhead allocation, you're going to go into activity-based costing. So now let's look at an example. Here we have a company that makes vegetable and tomato soup. Those are two different soups. So you can see that we're giving some information about the number of cans, the number of batches, the number of setups, and the cost per setup. The total volume of vegetable soup is 954,000 cans, and the total volume of tomatoes is 234,000. Each time Carver changes from a batch of one kind of soup to a batch of another kind of soup, it incurs a batch setup cost. They plan to make 180 batches of each soup in the accounting period. We can see the total setups there. are $360 and it's $264 per setup for a total cost of $95,040. If Carver allocates the batch setup costs to the two products based on the number of cans, which is a volume-based allocation rate or a traditional allocation rate, the overhead rate of 8 cents per can is found because we took the total overhead of $95.40 by the total number of cans of 1.88 million. Then we got the overhead for each by multiplying the 8 cents by the number of cans for each. So you can see that vegetable soup got 76,000 and change, and tomato soup got 18,000 and change. The volume-based allocation results in much more of the cost being allocated to vegetable soup, even though the cause of the 95,000 batch setups costs is the number of batches, not the number of cans. So this is where we get into the definition of a activity-based cost driver. Because the activity that is driving the 95,000 in cost is the actual setting up of the machines, we should be using the setups as the allocation base. If we use the number of batch setups as the more appropriate allocation base, then we get each product is calculated $47,520 in overhead costs, which makes more sense. This screen shows a comparison of the amounts using the the volume-based driver, which is traditional, versus the activity-based, which is ABC. The activity-based cost driver allocates relevant costs to the product. For example, if the company is considering dropping tomato soup, which method of allocation reveals how much of the $95,000 of batch setup costs would be saved? Well, it would be this, the activity-based, because we no longer would need to do those setups. If we use this basis, we would be underestimating our cost savings. So how do we actually identify the cost drivers in an ABC system? ABC stands for activity-based costing, and it's a two-stage allocation process, and multiple cost drivers are used. The first step is to identify the essential activities and costs required to perform the activities. Second, we allocate the cost from the specific activity cost pool to products using an activity rate based on the amount of the activity used by the product. So this sounds more complicated than it actually is. Basically what we're doing is we're using the same process that we did in Chapter 4, except we're coming up with multiple rates based on the number of activities and cost drivers that we have. So how do we pick our cost driver? Well, the first step is to identify and define the activities and activity pools. An activity cost pool is any part of the production process for which management would like separate reporting. So usually these are referred to as unit level activities, batch level activities, product level activities, and facility level activities. Unit level activities are performed each time a unit is produced. For example, providing power to run process equipment would be a unit level activity. Batch activities are performed each time a batch is handled or processed, regardless of how many units are in the batch. Product level activities relate to specific products and must be carried out regardless of how many batches are run or units produced and sold. For example, designing or advertising a product would be a product level activity. And then finally, facility level activities are carried out regardless of which products are produced, how many batches are run, or how many units are made. For example, heating a factory and cleaning executive offices are facility level activities. I'm going to pause here before I go into an example of how to perform activity-based cost allocation. So look to the next video for that example.